Hey everyone, it's Phil again, here for an episode of the Nuff said Bullpen, where we do interviews with people in the industry having anything to do with Marvel. Today, I'm very honored to be talking to definitely, when anyone mentions Daredevil comic book wise, her name always springs to mind, Miss Ann Nocenti. How you doing, Ann?
Hello, world.
Yeah, your run holds a special place in my heart just because the very first new issue of Daredevil I ever picked up was part of your run.
Oh.
So I think any Daredevil comic I read anymore, even subconsciously, I think I just compare it to your run.
I'm very proud of warping minds across the country.
And I love, like, when writers spend years on a book and, like, you know, they craft like this big elaborate storyline or different storylines. But I know the first thing I wanted to ask you is I was reading how did you get into comics? Because I was reading that growing up your parents sort of frowned on comic books.
Well, I think we were an academic household. So my dad was a scientist and my mother was a pharmacist, and we were pretty much encouraged to be academics. And so I think it's only natural that back in the 60s, other than, you know, underground comics, and it wasn't really seen as something that, you know, it's not like today where kids encounter comics. You know, they just weren't really around as much. And we did have the couple that we had, I was kind of obsessed with. We had a volume of Dick Tracy, and we had a volume of Pogo. And we had a couple, like, Betty, Veronica, and Jugheads, you know? Mm-hmm. And I would pore over them. The Dick Tracy especially felt very, you know, like I loved all the little gadgets. And the villains were deeply disturbing to me. But I had developed a kind of love of monsters at a young age. So I think they fit into my monster love. And Pogo was just sort of, Pogo's world is so cute and so like all the little cute animals, and I think that's probably how I responded to it as a young girl. And then rereading it years later, when I wrote a piece about Pogo, you know, it's only then that you realize how deep those stories went, in terms of like, commentaries, you know, on the war, on whatever, you know, Nixon, Agnew, Castro, you know. Mm-hmm. So those comics, and then I kind of just, I loved the way Betty and Veronica were drawn, and my favorite was Jughead, and I don't think it's kind of, when you're a kid, you know, I was certainly pre-feminist and didn't really quite understand that, you know, two women fighting over one guy was kind of not the greatest, you know, role model, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, because you got into a lot of social issues in your Daredevil run, and I was reading that I guess you butted heads with editorial a few times, which I find funny because you were an editor at Marvel.
You know, I don't even know where that story came from. I mean, you know, it's, you know, somebody else, who knows who writes your Wikipedia page? I have no idea. And it's always been in there, it caused problems with editorial, but I don't even know where that quote came from, or I don't think it has much basis in anything that actually happened, you know? I mean, Ralph Macchio was my editor for my entire run on Daredevil, and he was completely, you know, a wonderful editor, and, you know, if we butted heads at all, it was pretty minimal. You know, I think Ralph was very expansive and brilliant editor who pretty much let me do what I wanted and acted as a good editor should. He told me when I was doing something stupid and to cut it out, and you know.
Yeah.
So I don't know. You know, these little things end up someplace, and they don't really have much of a basis in anything that actually happened.
Yeah, I believe that, because, I mean, you were an experienced editor. I mean, I'm sure you knew what you could do and what you couldn't do.
Well, I think I was just an assistant editor back then. And, But I just don't remember butting heads. I remember butting heads with Jim Shooter, when I was an editor over different things I wanted to do in the books that like Chris Claremont was writing. But I mean, Ralph and I had a great relationship on Daredevil. So.
Oh, that's great. I don't know where to begin. I just have so many notes because, I mean, you were on the book from 1986 to 91. I don't know if it's like asking you to pick between your children, but if you could recommend one issue or one arc from your run for people to check out, what was your favorite, or what would you put out there?
Well, I think certainly they recently reprinted the first appearance of Typhoid Mary and having her whole, I mean, that was a very specific thing that I did in reaction to how females were portrayed in comics. They tended to be the nurse, the secretary, the mom, the whatever. And so I thought, well, I'll take all the stereotypes and stick them in one person. In hindsight, I don't think I was creating such a strong female character. I think I was just sticking all the stereotypes into one bag, and, and the whole storyline of Kingpin telling Typhoid Mary to go, get Daredevil through the heart, and how she used all her personalities to do that. And that, that storyline, I think I did a bunch of early stories that were just kind of like small urban New York stories because I lived in New York, and it was just done kind of documentary style. I would see something happening, or kids skateboarding, or some nut in 42nd Street, and I do stories. And then as I got to know Daredevil, and I think that's one of the real problems with writers not having long runs on books, you kind of like, you do like a year on a book, and if people don't think it's working, they replace you with another writer. Whereas it kind of takes you a while to get to know your character. And then they start speaking to you. And so it was really, I think John Romita Jr. and I creating Typhoid Mary was when we really started to, we created our first villain that was designed to complement Daredevil and Matt Murdock.
Yeah, that was gonna be my next question, was how did you create her? So you just took all those stereotypes and created this.
Yeah, and it's based on him. It's based on the fact that he tends to pick women that are either vulnerable and need help, and he needs to rescue them, or they're actual killers. And so she was both. So she appealed to Daredevil and Matt Murdock. And, there's a bunch of other storylines that I really like that, and in hindsight, to me, they show a kind of a struggle I was having with the repetitive narrative of a superhero comic, is that everything pretty much has to escalate into some kind of a fight. So it's an escalation narrative. And, you can't do a superhero comic without a fight. And I think that's probably, I think one time I even suggested to Ralph, why can't I do an issue where things don't escalate to a fight? And he just was like, get out of my office, forget that one. But, it's sort of like, not all conflict should end in violence and fighting. And I think that I was having this increasing, not uncomfortable so much as like I wanted to try and do something different with that. And so when John Romita Jr. and I created this character called Bullet, who had a son who was so, overwhelmed by the violence around him that he, became obsessed with the atomic bomb, and he started building a bomb shelter in his house. And then when Daredevil fought Bullet, they smashed through a anti-nuke peace rally. So I started to kind of try to embrace have the subplots or the atmosphere or literally the location of the fight somehow, without saying it, sort of display an alternative, something to resonate with how superhero story narratives are escalation narratives, and they kind of have to be. That's the genre. I mean, you wouldn't do a horror movie and not scare people, or a comedy and no one laughs, so,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah, I was rereading some of the old issues, preparing for this, and yeah, I can definitely see where you were coming from. There are plenty of situations where Matt, even, he said he didn't want to fight, and especially a very interesting arc when you had him and the others in Mephisto's realm,
yeah.
and he just decided he's like, the easiest, the best way to go about this is not to fight.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that was the story I pitched to Ralph, and he said, "Forget it." But maybe a little bit of it creeped in, and I don't really remember the continuity of everything, but I think maybe that came out of one of these shared universe events that we did at Marvel, which was we did the Mutant Massacre, and then when we did this one where Hell came to Earth, it becomes an excuse to do something outrageous where you can have Daredevil go to hell, because hell has come to Earth. And, normally it's not a Daredevil story. I mean, he doesn't normally, go to hell and fight Mephisto. And then, I think Silver Surfer was in that story,
So did you like that opportunity for the crossovers so Daredevil could play in the X-Men sandbox, or did you?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have him play in the X-Men sandbox. I just all the books, you plan these things editorially. You have a meeting and you say, okay, all the Marvel Comics books are going to hell this month, and then every editor calls all the writers and says, Marvel Comics are going to hell. Do you want to take your character to hell? And people go, yeah, or no, I'm involved in this arc and I don't want to play in this sandbox. And then, but if you have an opportunity, even in some mild way, like to have aspects of hell in your book, and then everybody that decides to played in that realm, and it gave you an excuse to do something, for me, something a little more operatic and, cosmic and operatic, because Daredevil is a kind of urban street book, and he should be an urban street book. And if you're going to do a cosmic operatic story, you're taking that rubber band and you're pulling it a little too far, but then you let it snap back.
But yeah, you mentioned the urban, but after Inferno, you had Karen break up with him, and then he kind of hit the road. Were you kind of wanting to deconstruct the character or just put him in a different environment?
Yeah, to see how he would, because for some reason, I could always imagine Daredevil flitting around on the rooftops of New York. You could, there's gargoyles up there, there's water towers, there's, clothing lines, there's all kinds of things where you can kind of, they can run along the rooftops and it sort of makes sense. But as soon as you leave an urban environment and you're out in suburbia or the country, how does an urban superhero get around? And they really stick out. So, I mean, for me, I think I always liked on the road stories. I always liked that kind of road movies. And so I wanted to play with that and then play with the idea of, how that red suit looks fine standing on a rooftop. It looks quite different walking down a street in suburbia.
Yeah, hitchhiking, yeah. But yeah, when he was on the road, I remember this is one of my first issues. I loved it. With the first appearance of Blackheart.
Oh yeah, he was fun, very fun character. The idea there being, the biblical myth of, Archangel, the Archangel that got kicked out of heaven for not wanting to obey the rules is Lucifer. So this was kind of a furtheration of that. The idea that, Mephisto's son, Blackheart, didn't want to be as nasty as his father. So, it was something that came out of that, the Inferno crossover.
Yeah, it's just incredible. Is it a weird feeling to create these characters like Typhoid Mary and Blackheart, and they're still there, and other people get to play with them and add to the legend? And
I mean, I think it's great. I don't necessarily know about those stories or read them because, it's just hard to, when you're busy in your life, it's hard to like say, oh, I wonder. So I don't really, but I mean, it's a lot to do with the art. I mean, writers are, we're sort of invisible nothings without artists, so it's also very much John Romita Jr. Once you're working with an artist, once I saw what he could do, and, then he, I think, did some of his most spectacular design work on reinventing the visuals for Mephisto and Hell and Blackheart. And so, a lot of it is also inspired by the artist you're working with. I mean, you're working with an artist and you want them to be able to show off and draw what they want to draw.
Mm-hmm. And then, I don't know if you've been watching Daredevil on Netflix. I think it's incredible. I've been waiting for them to put Typhoid Mary in there.
Yeah, I imagine they probably will at some point. It would be fun to see. I thought the first season was just spectacular. I just loved it. I mean, it not only seems extremely respectful to the comics, but it also, it takes it to its own new place, which, there are little things like, I think of Matt Murdock Daredevil as somebody who is extraordinarily empathic, has a lot of empathy, and then the Netflix series, at first it was a little startling with all the sound effects of the crunching of the bones when they'd have a fight and how brutal and violent he was, because it's sort of like, I'm like, that's a little bit more violent than the Daredevil I know. But, you also respect that it's a different medium, and so they had to take him someplace different.
Yeah, because I was even thinking that just the violence of the show. I'm just reading your issues. It seemed like he tried to dance around. He, instead of just wading in head first, he kind of tried to dance around stuff, especially with like people with like Bullet and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, he's a vigilante that's a pacifist at heart. He's very different from the Punisher or, somebody like Wolverine who just has his berserker rage, or, there's a lot of characters that go in pounding, and he is not one of those characters that goes in pounding. And so, it was a choice they made at the TV series. It was really the rest of it I thought was spectacular. It was the only one little tiny thing that gave me pause. But like I said, I think that it's a different medium, TV, and, they're doing their thing. And they did a great job, so, Yeah.
So you said you see Matt Murdock as a pacifist. Towards the end of your run, that whole Daredevil Bullseye storyline, was that a nervous breakdown Matt Murdock had? Because, we've seen he's had issues from time to time. Or was it just the weight of everything he went through, especially given the Mephisto's realm, that he actually forgot himself for a while?
Yeah, I think in hindsight, I don't, when you're writing comics, sometimes you have some stuff that's premeditated, and you have some stuff that just comes out of your unconscious, and you have to let the unconscious go and do its thing. And I don't remember my thinking back then, but I think it was probably a reaction to what I know about, like, what now they call PTSD, but back then I don't even think that phrase was around. Maybe it was in the late 80s, but it's kind of like, sometimes we'd sit around the Marvel offices and just have this discussion about, like, these superheroes go through so much crap, over and over and over and over. How come they're not insane? So, probably it was some reaction to that and PTSD and everything I'd put him through. And, and then you say, okay, let's try this in a way to sort of, it's like that, classic, a lot of writers over the years have done this, and I think I did it with some stories back in the 80s where you just suddenly go, what about that guy whose apple cart got tipped over? and he lost all his apples,
Mm-hmm.
who paid for that? What happened to that guy's life? So once in a while, you can get into the whole operatic bombast and mythical, wonderful world of superheroes, but then once in a while you go, well, wouldn't he be crazy?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the repercussions of these big, huge fights where people like tear New York apart? And so sometimes you want to do a story that reflects kind of that kind of a thing.
Yeah, I always took it as like I loved the Matt Murdock Karen Page relationship. Like even in Frank Miller's Born Again, like she came back in and he kind of helped her and built her back up. But then in your run, I think she was his rock, and she was helping to build him back up after everything went down.
Yeah.
And just towards the end of the run, I just felt that just after everything he went through without her, it just wore him down.
Yeah, he didn't have a rock anymore. And I think that just as I was leaving the book, I had him meet a young Hispanic girl, I think she was. She was either African American or Hispanic. I started like toying with the idea of having him have a relationship with a person of color, and he met her, and then that storyline was, and then I left the book, so I never really got to finish off that idea. But it was the instinct that you have to bring a rock back into his life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he didn't have Karen, he didn't even have Foggy or anyone. It was just very interesting. So, yeah, I remember the character you're talking about. So, that if you had stayed on, would that would have developed into a bigger relationship then?
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Okay.
I think that's where I was heading with it. But I was also like, my time on the book was done, and I knew it. Kind of like the last stories I wrote. I mean, I've never gone back to look at them, but I remember like. After 5 years, I was you almost have this instinct that you just want to step aside and let someone else do some, stories for a while. And I think, I had a whole bunch of stuff I wanted to do with him next. And then I left the book and, didn't get to do that stuff. But yeah, I think if I'd stayed on, he probably would have had a relationship with a person of color. And then who knows if Marvel would have let me do that back then.
Mm-hmm. No, that's interesting. So do you never go back and like take a look at the stuff you've written and published?
No, not really, because I mean, I don't know what other people do, but I don't go back and read my own work. And when you're at a convention and a fan brings up a story, a lot of them comics they bring up, you don't even remember writing them. And yeah, I'll look at the first page and I'll go, oh yeah, I remember this story.
Well, your list is so big. Yeah, it would be hard to remember.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you work in a business for 30 years, of course it's going to be like way too much stuff for you to even remember. Plus you have to, now people take a lot of time and care on a comic, and they are aware that they're works of literature and that they're going to be collected. Back then it was just, you're on deadline, you got to do another story. There was no sense that your work was going to be collected or looked at again,
Mm-hmm. But, so yeah, like I said, you have a big list of Marvel stuff. What Marvel character was like, would you say you related to the most? Was it Matt Murdock or was it someone else?
I mean, I don't know about relating to them so much as enjoying writing each one, because you'd look at another character like Spider-Man and you'd say, wow, it would hit you one day like, oh man, I have a perfect Spider-Man story that will really take his whole sense of guilt and responsibility and trying to do like juggle his job and web sticking the camera up and, bringing Aunt May home something, that she wants, and hiding everything. And, and then you're just like, you just start to get this. It's not like you relate to Spider-Man so much as you get a yearning to tell a certain story. And I did this one story with Mike Mignola where I was just like, what is it like to lie all the time? Mm-hmm. Like Spider-Man's a liar. He's got to lie all the time. So we did a story where it was just like a kind of a surreal, story where Peter Parker had to kind of confront the fact that he's always lying. And, so there was that story, and there was a story I did with, who was it? Death with, Thanos.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's again like what I was talking about before. It's not normally Spider-Man wouldn't fight Death himself, but, I wanted to do a story that had something really, really small and mundane in it and something hugely operatic. So the story is about how Aunt May needs a bottle of ketchup, I think. And, he goes through this incredibly cosmic, wild journey. Mm-hmm. And in the back of his head, it's just as important that he has to get the bottle of ketchup home to Aunt May, So, you just sort of, you try and find a story that fits the character perfectly.
Yeah, I read those. Those were great. And I also liked, speaking of Spider-Man, you wrote like a 3-issue story where, he was like locked up in an asylum, and I think most of the story, he wasn't even in costume.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was a reaction to, I had been, I had done a bunch of volunteer work in an asylum, and, mm-hmm. It was something that the artist I work with, Cynthia Martin, was interested in. And so it sort of, again, as a writer, you really are an invisible ghost until you find out what artist you're working with. And you want to do a story that you don't just want to send something to an artist and say, here, draw this. You want to do something that the artist is going to get into. Mm-hmm. So, I think Cynthia and I probably just hung around the Marvel offices, and talked for a while, and just said, hey, and then maybe also it was born out of this idea that why aren't these guys bonkers, to do what they do every day, they should be quite, they should be just roiling with all kinds of psychoses.
Yeah. I think that's everything I had. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Sure.
Like I said, I've wanted to talk to you since your original Daredevil run, but do you want to promote anything? What are you working on now, or social media, anything?
Well, I mean, I did 4 years at DC Comics, mm-hmm. and I did Catwoman was a lot of fun with Rafa Sandoval. I mean, he's just this Spanish artist with this amazing energy that he put into Catwoman. I mean, the way she scampered around the city and how great she looked, and he just designed her really well. Gave her a great haircut, put her in awesome clothes, Yeah,
I read that.
I mean, that was a lot of fun working with him. And then Trevor McCarthy, again, it's like, Trevor McCarthy's style, you go down roads you wouldn't normally go down. We did Clarion, who is kind of like, a Jack Kirby 1973 creation of like mm-hmm. He's almost like a goth Harry Potter created like 40 years ago. And, so that was a lot of fun. And now I'm working on, a creator-owned comic.
Is there anywhere people can go to check that out, or?
Well, it's still, in the world building process. So it's not, there's nothing to see yet.
Well, do you have a website or anything people can check out for?
I have a website, but it's like, I haven't looked at my own website in so long. Someone told me that half the links are broken, and and there's nothing new for 5 years, but it's just my name, but with IE, AnnieNocenti.com. And like I said, it's like a cranky old half broken website that I probably should dust off and look at,
Yeah.
someday.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been great.
Sure.
And that's it, everyone. Until next time, enough said. Wow, that was a really great interview. Like I told her, I've been waiting to talk to her for such a long time. Ever since I read those Daredevil stories in the late 80s, early 90s. If you're a comics creator out there, Marvel, I do a DC podcast too, so anyone who wants to, any comic creators out there from Marvel or DC, you want to talk to me, you can email me, nightwingpdp@gmail.com, and on Twitter, I am at nightwingpdp. And any feedback, and anyone listening to it, please, let me know what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong. All right, like I said, I'd like to do this again. So until then, Nuff said.
Enough said.